Welcome to Anastasia's Whisper, the quiet space where history slows down and even the most ancient stories are told in a voice soft enough for sleep. Tonight, we travel north, beyond the fjords and the frost-tipped mountains, to a land of pine and quiet sky, where a low wooden longhouse breathes gently against the cold. Inside, the fire is glowing, and the Vikings are not fighting or sailing. They're sleeping. But before we step through the creaking door of the Longhouse, just a soft reminder. If you'd like to keep this little sanctuary close, you're warmly invited to like this video and subscribe, not just to support the channel, but so that whenever rest feels far away, you'll always know where to find your way back. And if you feel like sharing, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. There's something deeply calming about seeing our little circle of night owls stretch quietly across the world. Now, let your shoulders drop, let the noise fade, and come with me into the warm, smoky hush of the Viking Longhouse, where stories settle and sleep begins. Let's begin. When archaeologists uncovered the remains of Viking longhouses across Scandinavia, they found more than walls. They found patterns. Benches built into the walls, fire pits dug like shallow spines through the center, and signs of daily life layered in ash and clay. That told a quiet story of how people rested and what their place by the fire meant. Viking society was built on rank and role. At the top were the jarls, local chieftains or noblemen. Below them the carls, or free farmers, landowners who formed the backbone of the community. And beneath them, the thralls, enslaved laborers who had no rights, but whose presence was embedded in every household. In the Longhouse, this hierarchy unfolded again each night, in silence, in order, in sleep. The central fire ran down the middle of the hall, a rectangular hearth, sometimes lined with stone or clay. This wasn't just for cooking, it was for heat and survival. The bondi, a free landowner, usually a carl, slept closest to the fire. His place wasn't just tradition, it was practical. The fire burned brightest there, and in the long Nordic winters, proximity to that warmth could mean life or illness. Beside him slept his wife, the Husfreyja. Historical records like the Icelandic sagas describe the Husfreyja as the keeper of the household, the woman who managed everything within the home: linen, food, grain, social standing. She was often buried with keys at her waist, a literal symbol of her control over the domestic sphere. It's likely they slept with woolen underclothes, and sometimes even cloaks still wrapped around them. They didn't change into sleepwear. They slept in what they wore, layered, warm, efficient. Benches along the walls were sometimes wide enough for sleeping. Remnants of straw bedding, fur, and woven wool have been found in excavation layers, especially at sites like Borg in Lofoten and Trelleborg in Denmark. The further one slept from the hearth, the lower their rank, and the colder their nights. Children, workers, visiting travelers, and eventually the thralls. Thralls, if allowed to sleep inside, were assigned the ends of the hall. There, the fire's warmth barely reached. Some slept beside animals, as longhouses often housed livestock at one end, both to shelter them and to share their body heat with the family. Archaeological studies from farmsteads in Iceland show animal stalls built directly into the longhouse floor plan, separated only by timber partitions or low earthen ridges. This closeness between humans and animals, between labor and warmth, was part of Viking pragmatism. Sleep was shared, not just with kin, but with the entire ecosystem of the household. Wool-stuffed pillows were rare. More often, folded cloaks or arms served as headrests. Some beds may have been shared by multiple family members. Privacy was not expected. Still, the placement of each sleeper told a deeper story. Not just who was tired, but who had status, who had earned warmth, who had the right to dream beside the fire, and who didn't. Even in stillness, the longhouse held order, and as the fire flickered low, as ash settled and breath slowed, the quiet rules of the day became the sleeping map of the night. But what did it feel like to sleep there? To listen to a world built of wind and breath? Let's hear it. When night settled over a Viking homestead, it didn't bring silence. It brought a different kind of sound, the sound of a world exhaling. The longhouse didn't sleep all at once. Sleep came gradually as the fire burned down to coals and the last tasks of the evening faded into hush. At its heart, the fire never fully went out. Most longhouses, as discovered at excavation sites like Firekot in Denmark, were built around a central hearth trench. Its embers were preserved through the night, tended carefully by someone half awake, adding small sticks or peat bricks at intervals. This fire wasn't just warmth, it was memory. Its crackling was the soft pulse of the home, and the sound it made, low, uneven, alive, was the background music to every Viking night. Above the rafters creaked. Timber, warmed by fire and cooled by night, shifted with the temperature. Some nights it groaned, as if the beams were breathing too. Wind slid along the thatched or turf roof. Many Viking homes were topped with sod, grass-covered insulation, sometimes up to 30 centimeters thick. This softened the noise of the storm, but not completely. Wind still found its way in, through the smoke vent, a gap in the roof where heat escaped and air was drawn in, through the gaps between timbers, through the edges of the door. And when it passed through, it howled. Not all at once, just now and then, a long whistle, a sudden gust, like a voice in the dark that never quite reached language. Inside, animals stirred. Many longhouses were shared with livestock, especially during winter. Goats, sheep, cows, and chickens slept at one end of the structure, either penned in low wooden stalls or separated by a ridge of packed earth. They weren't silent either. A sheep might shift in its bedding. A chicken might cluck once, then resettle into its feathers. Cattle breathed heavily. Steam rose from their noses into the chill. Their heat, along with the humans, helped warm the air. Dogs were common, not pets, as we imagine today, but companions and guards. They curled near the benches, sometimes letting out low grumbles or twitching in dreams. And people? People moved. They shifted, coughed, adjusted cloaks, woke and dozed again. Snoring was common, echoing softly along the wooden walls. It didn't bother anyone. It was part of the soundscape, like the fire, like the wind, like the animals. Some spoke, A child asking a question before falling asleep. An old man remembering something long buried. A quiet story murmured from one bench to another. Stories were the glue of Viking culture, not just sagas of war, but small personal tales told in the dark. Maybe a fable, maybe a warning, maybe a dream someone couldn't quite keep to themselves. These were the moments not written in runes, but lived again and again. The sounds of the Viking night weren't loud. They were layered. Fire, wood, wind, breath, livestock, dreams. It wasn't noisy, but it wasn't silent either. And in those moments, with the cold outside and the fire inside, sleep didn't feel like escape. It felt like belonging. But in the far north, night wasn't always measured in hours. Sometimes it stretched into weeks. And the further you went, the more the line between night and day began to blur. So how did the Vikings sleep when the sun disappeared? Let's go deeper into the season of shadow. In the lands of the north, winter was not a pause. It was a second world, a world where light grew scarce, and the Longhouse became the only universe that mattered. In Viking territories, from Norway's fjords to Iceland's volcanic plains, the winter sun could disappear for days at a time. In parts of northern Scandinavia, even weeks. When the darkness came, so did the deep sleep, not all at once, not like the kind we know, but in rhythms shaped by cold, by stillness, by the slowing of the human body. Historians believe that pre-modern Northern Europeans, including the Norse, may have practiced what's now called segmented sleep. It was a two-part slumber, not 8 hours in a row, but a first sleep, followed by a quiet, wakeful interval, then a second sleep, until morning. In winter, these cycles stretched even longer. Without artificial light, the body aligned with the sun, or the absence of it. People often fell asleep not long after sunset, and may have woken for an hour or two in the middle of the night to tend the fire, to whisper, to reflect, to pray, then slept again until dawn, whenever dawn finally came. The Longhouse absorbed this rhythm. Its walls were thick, sometimes packed with turf or clay, its roof insulated with sod, its air heavy with the breath of humans and animals alike. Inside, it was warm, not hot, but warm enough to make rest possible. People lay side by side in furs and cloaks, beneath woven wool blankets, breathing into the same air that had nowhere else to go. The night wasn't measured in hours. It was measured in tasks, in moments of waking, in turning logs, in quiet thoughts that wandered through sleep and back again. Outside, the snow silenced everything. Even the animals grew quiet. Livestock slept longer. Dogs curled deeper. And the people, they settled into a kind of stillness we've forgotten. A stillness that wasn't boredom or impatience, but a form of peace. They lived with the season. They let it reshape them. Sleep was deeper. Dreams were longer. And in the middle of it all, the fire kept glowing. A red thread stretched through the dark. Because even in a winter that swallowed the sun, the Vikings kept the flame alive. And through that flame, they remembered the world outside. But what about visitors? What if someone arrived in the night? A traveler, a stranger, a wandering Skald. Where would they sleep? And what did hospitality mean in a house that never closed its eyes? Let's open the door and see who was allowed in. Hospitality was never optional in the Viking world. It was law, not written in stone, but etched into the very rhythm of their lives, because in a land of cold wind, wet earth, and long distances, a traveler knocking at your door wasn't an inconvenience. They were a test of your honor, of your house, of how the gods might see you tomorrow. According to Norse tradition, guests were sacred. The sagas tell us that Odin himself, the All-Father, would sometimes wander the earth in disguise, a gray-cloaked stranger with one eye and no name, seeking warmth, food, and kindness. So turning someone away was a risk you never took. And so, even when space was tight, when the benches were full and the fire already surrounded by sleeping bodies, a visitor still had a place. Sometimes they slept near the door, not for lack of welcome, but for easy exit and a mark of their outsider status. But sometimes they were honored. If the visitor was a skald, a poet, they were treated with reverence. Skalds were the memory keepers of Norse culture. They carried no swords, but their words had power. They could elevate a warrior to legend or reduce a proud house to ridicule. A well-respected skald was given a place near the fire, sometimes even beside the bondi himself. Their reward was warmth, food, mead, and a bench soft with wool. They might be asked to perform after supper, their voice rising over the fire's glow, recounting stories of the gods, of glory, of grief, and later. When the fire was low and the benches began to still, the skald would lie down like everyone else. No ceremony, no stage, just another breath in the house. Sometimes the visitor was a relative from another village, a cousin on business, a niece, newly wed, a brother passing through after years abroad. These too were welcomed and slept where space allowed, between kin, beneath firs, beside the hearth if they were favored. Archaeological evidence from sites like Hedeby and Birka suggests that longhouses varied in length and status. Some were modest and narrow, others stretched up to 30 meters, able to house families, livestock, servants, and guests all under one roof. And always, the rule was this: if you had warmth, you shared it, even with strangers, because someday you might be that traveler, that skald, that soul walking alone toward a distant firelight, and you would hope that someone would make room for you. But the longhouse didn't belong only to the living. The dead were never far. And in Viking culture, the boundary between sleep and death was thinner than you might think. So next, let's listen to what they believed happened in the space between dreams and the afterlife. In the Viking imagination, the night was never just night. It was a threshold, a door, a place where the world of the living and the world of the unseen sometimes shared the same air. They believed in many worlds, not just Midgard, where people lived, but Hel and Asgard and Vanaheim, realms reached not by foot, but by fate. And sleep was the closest we came to crossing over. They didn't separate dreams from visions. A dream could be a message, a warning, a glimpse of the future, or a visit from the past. Some Viking sagas speak of Draugr, the restless dead, beings who refuse to stay buried, jealous of the warmth they once knew, haunting longhouses, slipping into the dreams of the living. So precautions were taken. Iron hung over doorways. Rituals were whispered before sleep. The hearth was guarded. Fire was not just for heat. It was protection, a symbol of life, of boundary, of all that held darkness at bay. Children were told to sleep close to kin, to not wander at night, to not speak of dreams until daylight came. And yet, not all spirits were feared. Some were protective ancestors, guardians who watched from the rafters, from the cold corners of the hall. If you dreamed of a loved one, especially one who had passed, it wasn't cause for alarm. It meant you were being remembered, that your bond still held across the space between. There's little archaeological evidence to tell us how these beliefs shaped exact sleeping habits, but we know from burial sites, from sagas, from oral traditions, that the Vikings viewed death and sleep as kin. They called it svefn, a word used for rest, and for eternal rest. The Longhouse, at night, became a space of echoes. Not loud, not terrifying, just deep. Every log creak, every gust of wind, every shifting shadow meant something. And when you finally closed your eyes, wrapped in furs, surrounded by breath and darkness and firelight, you did not just fall asleep, you crossed over into the quiet mystery of the other side of waking. But morning always returned, and with it, the stirring of a new day. The fire relit, the animals fed, the smoke rising again toward the pale blue sky. Let's follow them into that moment, the soft rituals of waking inside a world still holding its breath. Waking in a Viking longhouse wasn't sudden. It didn't come with alarm bells or rushed footsteps or the flick of a switch. It came gradually, with the smell of smoke, the feel of cold air seeping in through the walls, and the soft sounds of others beginning to stir. The first to rise was often the one who had tended the fire through the night, someone older, trusted, quiet in their movements. They added wood, carefully, not to wake the others, just enough to rouse the coals and warm the heart of the home. There was no clock to beat. Time was measured by the sky, and in winter, dawn was slow. A gray light crept in through the smoke hole in the roof, not direct, just a faint awareness that the world beyond the walls was waking too. The longhouse smelled of ash, wool, and sleep. Blankets were folded, benches cleared, children pulled on tunics over the clothes they had slept in. The fire grew, and with it, the rhythm of life returned. Water was warmed for washing. Flatbread dough made the night before was moved to the coals. Salted fish or smoked meat was laid near the fire, not cooked fresh, but reheated gently, enough to soften, enough to nourish. Outside, livestock stirred in their stalls. The dog stretched, yawned, shook the sleep from its fur, and inside voices returned, low, hoarse with mourning, but calm. No one rushed. The Norse day began not with urgency, but with necessity. Grain to grind, wool to spin, tools to sharpen, children to dress, men readied for work or war, depending on the season. Women took stock of food stores, checked the drying fish, the condition of stored apples, onions, or cheese. There was no chore that didn't matter. And even as the longhouse emptied, some going to the fields, some to the boat, some to the woods, a few always remained. The longhouse never fully slept, and it never fully woke. It breathed with the people inside it, a space that held fire, food, family, and the soft rituals of another day survived. But what if we step outside now, just for a moment? Let's leave the warmth and look at the longhouse from the outside. How it stood, how it aged, and what it meant, not just as a building, but as a living part of Viking life. Step outside, and the longhouse appears almost like a shadow in the land, low, long, a part of the ground not set apart from it, built not to impress, but to survive. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of Viking longhouses across Scandinavia, each a little different, but echoing the same shape. Long, narrow rectangles, ranging from 15 to over 30 meters in length, thick wooden frames, walls made from vertical planks or wattle and daub, woven twigs covered with mud and straw. The roof arched like a boat flipped upside down, and sometimes it was covered with layers of turf, a green roof, living, insulating, growing quietly with the seasons. Some had smoke holes, some had no opening at all, letting the smoke from the fire slowly gather under the beams until it found its own way out. There were few windows. Light came from the fire or from the gaps in the boards. From the outside, you might not even notice the house right away, especially in winter when snow draped the roof and the wood blended into the frost-covered trees. But beneath that surface was life, a world of breath and heat and human sound, a house built not for decoration, but for meaning. The longhouse was where generations lived and died, where children were born, meals were shared, fires were tended, and sleep held everyone together. It was a shelter, yes, but more than that. It was identity. The head of the household was often buried nearby, in some cases inside. The house outlived the people, and in time when it was no longer used, it wasn't torn down. It was left to rest, to collapse slowly into the earth. At places like Borg in Norway and Tissø in Denmark, archaeologists found the post holes, perfect outlines in the soil where great timber beams once stood. Nothing remains above ground, and yet everything remains. You can still trace where the fire once burned, where the benches were, where warmth once bloomed in the middle of a frozen night. The longhouse faded quietly, like an old breath exhaled back into the landscape, but its shape lingers in memory. Even today you can feel it, that long, low shadow, that line of earth, that quiet presence, still holding the silence of sleep, still remembering the sound of stories. But let's go back inside now, because in the heart of the longhouse, there is still something left to tell, how the smallest among them slept, the infants, the toddlers, the children of frost and fire. Let's listen to the rhythms of Viking childhood and how the very first dreams were dreamt. In the quiet warmth of the longhouse, not every breath belonged to warriors or elders. Some were smaller, faster, softer, the breath of children. The Viking world was hard, but it was also full of life, and children were everywhere. They ran between the legs of cattle, helped stir the stew, listened to stories, then whispered their own. But when night came, they didn't sleep far from home, because home was everything. Infants, especially, were kept close. There are few surviving Viking cradles, but depictions and burial evidence suggest that babies were swaddled in wool, wrapped tightly in furs, and nestled either beside the mother or in cradle boxes tucked against the wall. Sometimes the cradle was hung from beams above the bench, gently swinging with the motion of the longhouse. A fire glowed below. A mother's hand rested nearby, and the sounds of sleep, the slow rhythm of a dozen breathing bodies, lulled the child toward rest. Older children didn't sleep apart. They shared benches with siblings, cousins, sometimes even with the family dog curled at their feet. There were no nightlights, no lullabies recorded in history, but there was sound, and that was enough. The rustle of straw, the murmur of voices, the smell of smoke and wool and salted fish. For a Viking child, bedtime was not a private thing. It was shared. It was safe. Some sagas speak of child-stealing spirits, and mothers were known to tie bits of iron near the cradle to ward off the unseen. But most nights were quieter than that. Just a hand stroking a brow, a fire slowly dying, a whisper, "Sleep now. There is light in the morning." And so they slept, growing slowly, dreaming softly, wrapped in the same world that held their ancestors. No doors, no distance, just the longhouse, longer than a memory, wider than a name, a cradle for them all. But the longhouse didn't sleep forever. The world outside was always changing. Storms, raids, journeys. And sometimes, sleep happened far from home. What happened when Vikings slept on ships, or under the stars, or in the smokehouses of distant lands? Let's follow them out of the longhouse and into the unknown. Not all Viking sleep happened under a roof. Not all dreams came beside a fire. Some were shaped by motion, by waves, by wind, by the long silence of unfamiliar land. Because the Vikings moved. They were farmers, yes, but also traders, raiders, sailors, and settlers. From the shores of Iceland to the rivers of Kiev, from the Scottish Isles to the gates of Constantinople, they wandered. And wherever they went, they had to rest. So where did a Viking sleep when there was no longhouse? On ships, they slept in the open, the famous Viking longships, sleek, fast, elegant, had no cabins, no hammocks, no shelter, just a deck, an oar, a place to sit, and a place, when needed, to lie down. During long journeys, the warriors slept on deck, using their shields as mats, fur cloaks wrapped around them, helmets set beside their heads. The cold wind came in waves, the salt dried on their lips. But they slept, because they had to. Sleep didn't wait for luxury. It waited for exhaustion. Some ships carried canvas or woolen coverings to drape across the beams, simple tents to block wind and spray. But in most cases, the sky was their roof. And when they reached land, sometimes they found shelter, a barn, a monastery, an abandoned outpost. Sometimes they brought their own. At sites like Trelleborg and Jarlshof, remnants of turf houses, temporary shelters, and cooking pits suggest that Vikings built camp dwellings wherever they stayed long enough. In Greenland, they constructed small sod-walled houses, thick, warm, and close to the earth. In Ireland and the Isle of Man, they likely stayed in simple wooden houses, borrowed or built fast. And when there was nothing, they slept near the fire, a circle of stones, a woolen cloak, a shield at their back. Sleep was not optional. It was a kind of armor, because no warrior, no farmer, no explorer can live without rest. And even in those far-off places, under the stars, Vikings dreamed of home, of benches, of firelight, of breath rising in the dark, inside a longhouse that always remembered them. But not every night was spent in safety. There were dangers in the dark, seen and unseen. What were the Vikings afraid of as they drifted into sleep? Let's step into their fears, into the night terrors they named, and those they didn't. Even among warriors, there were things that could not be fought, not with swords, not with strength, only with silence and sleep. The Vikings feared the dark, not in the way we do, but in the older way, the ancient way, because darkness was never empty. It was full of things that walked without sound, spirits, oaths, shadows, and every longhouse had its stories. They feared the Draugr, restless dead who refused their burial, pale, bloated figures, often from drowned ships or broken promises. The sagas tell of them crawling from mounds, stealing warmth, riding men in their sleep. They were not ghosts. They were wrongness, unfinished, hungry. To protect the house, iron was used, a knife placed under the pillow, a nail driven into the threshold, because iron, cold, forged, elemental, was believed to repel spirits. Doors were locked with runes, symbols carved for peace, protection, or binding, and sometimes bundles of herbs, like juniper or angelica, were hung over beds or near cradles. Their scent was not for comfort, it was for warding. Sleep was sacred and fragile. A baby might be wrapped in red thread. A pregnant woman might sleep with iron at her feet. A warrior might refuse to dream on certain nights, when the moon was wrong or the stars too quiet. The boundary between worlds was believed to thin during Yule, the darkest time of winter. On those nights, some said the wild hunt rode through the sky, a ghostly procession of horses and riders, led by Odin or a dark spirit, gathering souls, whipping through the wind. To stay safe, the Vikings stayed indoors. Doors were barred, fires burned brighter, and prayers, if they were whispered, were spoken in Old Norse, half memory, half invocation. Still, they slept, because even when fear crept in with the frost, they knew how to endure. They were not strangers to the night, only respectful of what it could hold. And in time, the dark would lift. The fire would burn clean again. The sun would return. The dreams would fade. But now, let's leave the fears behind. Let them drift into the night that no longer needs them. We've walked through the longhouse. We've heard its breath, its warmth, its history. Let's lie back down, wrap ourselves again in fur and silence, and let the last part of this story be rest. Lie down now, wherever you are. Let the room grow still. Let your shoulders soften. Let the edges of your thoughts fall quiet. We've wandered far tonight, through firelight and fur, through snow and wind, through the soft breath of the longhouse where the past still rests. So now, come back inside, back to the warmth, back to the slow rhythm of sleep that generations once knew. You're lying on a bench, wide, wooden, smooth with use. Above you, thick beams curve like the ribs of a ship. The fire in the hearth crackles softly, casting orange light on the wool across your chest. You hear breath, not your own, but the breath of those beside you. Children murmuring in their dreams. A dog sigh from beneath the bench. Someone shifts on straw nearby, then settles again. This is not the modern world. No machines, no glow, just quiet and time. Outside, the wind moves gently across the sod roof. Snow drifts past the smoke hole, but inside, there's only warmth. You turn your head, feel the wool beneath your cheek, and for a moment, you are a memory resting inside a memory. A life inside a longhouse, wrapped in fur, in a winter that will wait for you. There's nothing left to do, no one calling, no one watching, just fire, just night, just you. And in this stillness, you begin to drift, not down, but inward, into a place where breath slows and dreams begin their soft weaving, like wool spun by hands you'll never meet, but somehow remember. So sleep now. The longhouse will hold you, the fire will keep watch, and the dark will sing you, slowly, safely, home.